Hi, welcome back to Power Storytime. I'm Kate, the creative director of Calling Card Books and Z Girls Press, and every Wednesday at noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we read from one of our books. So far, we've been reading from Finding the Lost by Michael Foster, and he's joining us again today. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Hi, Kate.
And if you guys are enjoying these, please share them with family or friends who might also be interested. Like our page, subscribe to our channel, and keep watching. And so we want to get back into asking you some questions while we got you, Michael. So last week we finally met the Silver King. We've heard about him, but we finally met the Third Ancient and saw all the drama there. And I wanted to ask, out of all of the secondary characters in this book, which one is your favorite, or which one was the most fun to write?
Actually, I think it was Tawny, the cougar. I watched I have two cats, and I watched their behaviors and how they react to humans and stuff. And I found that to be the most intriguing character because I was building the relationship between Alicia and Tawny, and how that happened. So I think that was probably my favorite, but probably second interesting. You mentioned the Silver King is probably the second because I was able to bring in some evilness to the character, and I wanted to create it in a way that seems like maybe it's going to be helpful, but subtly those working on those subtle undertones that kind of put you on edge as a reader, like, okay, something's not quite right here, and how to write that without giving it all away right at the beginning.
Yeah, sometimes the bad guys or the frenemies are like the most interesting characters because you just never know which way they're going to go, if they're going to be an ally or if they're going to kind of screw you over. Mm-hmm. And you definitely get that with Silver King. Yeah. And I agree about Tawny. I love her because in the first book we're so used to all of the talking animals or the ones that can communicate, and she's kind of also in that frenemy range where at first we don't know if she's on Alicia's side or not because she can't communicate in the same way that the other animals could. So it's that tension of is it a friend, is it a foe? We just don't know.
Yeah. I loved building their relationship, and the moment I don't know how far you got with the Silver King.
She had just escaped from him, and she reached the outside of the cave, and that's all we saw. So we haven't seen the aftermath quite yet, but we saw her fleeing from the leeches.
Okay. When she bursts out of the cave and Tawny has that moment of confusion, like, there's no one chasing you. What's going on here? Doesn't quite understand. And how they bond after this was a very important part of the story to me.
Yeah, it's a really, really sweet scene. And the whole scene with the Silver King is so scary, and he's such a creepy character, and the way you describe him, he's just like, his look is very creepy. How did you come up with that? How did you decide to make him look like that? Was it inspired by anything? Like, I kind of think of when you go to the beach and you like make the little sand castles by dropping mud.
Yeah,
that's how I imagine him.
His throne, definitely. I imagine these bits of melted, silver, like mercury, just dropping and forming and kind of solidifying where they are to make the throne. And then when I thought of maybe at one point Silver King did look more human-like, but he's been when he was at the height of his power before all of this, but all of these years, thousands of years down in the dark, just slowly decaying. I just pictured his body kind of melting and collapsing,
that's great, because I think in that chapter you kind of compare him to when she puts her arm through the wet beam and it goes right through, and like she thinks about that in relation to him and how he's kind of rotting as well. That's a good,
so creepy,
good and gross connection. Yeah,
so creepy.
Can't see it, but our floor direction just made this face at that. And then we talked last week about you going into the real life mine and exploring in there to your great personal danger. And you've described yourself as being a free-range child in the past. So I want to know, what is your favorite childhood memory, or, you know, adult memory from your free-range childhood?
It wasn't so much free range, but there was between our cabin's dock and our neighbor's cabin's dock, you have to go around a point on the lake that sticks out into the lake. If you're following the lake shore, and as a child, we had these, you know, old big tractor tire inner tubes, right? You know,
yeah.
With the stem that pokes up, you got to make sure it's flipped upside down so it's poking into the water and stabbing you. And I used to float on one of those inner tubes and float right along the shoreline and look. It was almost a miniature world. Little caves, little like coves formed by the bushes or the rocks, and there were dark spaces, and maybe those dark spaces held snakes, which I loved. I was never scared of snakes. Or maybe they held a frog, or maybe it was a den of leeches or something. And I would drift all the way around, getting out of sight of my dock, and off around to the point, and then around the corner until I reached the neighbor's dock. Just examining this and building my own imaginary world of what was happening along that shoreline, the little miniature world that for me was kind of massive as a child. And it's definitely a memory that sticks with me, that you know, I miss those days. I still love exploring, but that magic that I could just discover in kind of this little echo sphere of space was always wonderful.
Yeah, there's something extra special about doing that as a child, and especially summers. There's something extra special about experiencing, you know, the freedom of summer and exploring around when you're a little kid, that it's just not the same as an adult. Okay.
Did you ever want to be a park ranger or a botanist like your character?
I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Actually, and I was very much into that when I was, you know, in single-digit age range, and I wanted to be the person who built the first device that was capable of taking a human down into, like, to the Marianas Trench, like the deepest place in the world, something like that. It's funny, since then I've had some traumatic experiences where I've almost drowned twice. No. And I now have a little bit of a phobia of deep water if I can't see the bottom. I was recently in Hawaii, and we were out in the ocean. We were probably a mile from shore on paddleboards, but the water was so clear. It was 60 feet deep or so, but I could see all the way down to the sand on the bottom. I had no fear, zero fear of that. But if I were unable to see the bottom in that situation, I try to just not think about it. But if I start thinking about it, I freak out, and I don't know what causes the fear. Am I afraid of a monster down there? Am I afraid of dying? Am I afraid I'm going to drown? I don't know what it is. But it's, yeah. So my dream of being a marine biologist, that's gone now.
The mysteries of the trench will remain. You'll never find the deep sea leeches.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's so fascinating. Well, I think that's all the questions I had for you. I don't know. Did you have another one, Floor Director? No.
No, I don't. We're a little late, so.
Yes, we had an exciting meeting before this.
We get to the reading then.
Yeah, thanks for joining us again, Michael.
Always a pleasure.
Bye.
Okay, so as we said last week, we met the Silver King, and Alicia, went to go ask him for help, and we thought that he was perhaps the last hope that was going to save her, but instead he realized that she has power and he wants it for himself. So his leeches up in the rafters dropped down and chased her out of the mine, trying to latch on and steal her blood, and she just barely escaped out and is now running away with Tawny to try and escape the Silver King and his leeches. Let me take a little sip of water. And you can see the kind of mudded mercury that we were talking about earlier. He's such a interesting looking fella. Alright, so now we're going to start with Chapter 16, Family Now. Alicia hadn't stopped running until she arrived back at her camp. By then, night had fully descended. The cougar paced her the entire way, frequently looking back over its shoulder in confusion, unable to determine what chased them and wondering why the girl was so focused on running. Alicia quickly gathered dead branches and materials she had collected earlier in the day, throwing them into the rock circle she had created. She was freezing and wet and needed to get a fire going before she could even think about anything else. Alicia pulled the box of matches out of her pack and quickly started a warm blaze, larger than she had built on previous nights. Only then did she sit down on a large log and go to work, pulling the leeches off, one by one, depositing them none too gently into the flames. She counted 13 in total. Standing, she stripped off her wet clothes and searched her skin by the light of the fire to make sure there were no more hiding out of sight. Thin ribbons of blood streamed down her arms and legs from the wound left behind by the worms. Alicia scraped the final leech from her arm and flung it into the fire. Hearing it sizzle and watching the smoke rise from the curling body gave her a sense of relief. She knew some of the blood burned and smoked in there as well, and almost felt bad for the foul creature, but she was exhausted and upset from her encounter with the Silver King. Sadly, there was little room for compassion in a mind filled with anger. Alicia took her wet clothes and draped them over a spot on the log where the heat of the fire would dry them. Pulling her blanket out of her pack, she wrapped it around her body and sat back down on the log. She looked over at her guardian, the great cat. Tawny gave a long stretch and growl, spreading herself to full length beside the fire, and raised her eyes to the girl. "You're so lucky you didn't follow me in there," Alicia told the cat. "There was more than just cold water and wet feet. I don't think you could have protected me from what was inside. I don't even want to think about it." Alicia shuddered from more than just the cold and found herself unable to stop shaking. She stood and pulled her makeshift seat cover closer to the fire, or makeshift seat even closer to the fire, hoping the warmth could drive away the lingering terror inside. She felt a trickle on her neck and reached quickly back to grab whatever lurked there, but it was only a drop of water sliding down from her still wet hair. Realizing this, Alicia finally burst into great sobs. The sobs carried with them relief from having escaped the evil king's domain, but also hopelessness about the situation she currently found herself in. What was she to do now? At this moment, she felt small and fragile, like one of Vulcan's sprites. It seemed like she could only watch events unfold around her with no control of anything, like a bug on a leaf being swept down a river. At any moment, she expected some great metaphorical fish to leap out of the rapids and devour her. She couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she'd barely escaped literally being eaten alive today. Alicia had counted on the Ancient Ones being able to help her, and the Silver King had been her last hope. She imagined he must have been a great ruler at one point, watching over his underground kingdom of ore, but his bitterness at losing his realm had taken over. He lost all signs of kindness, leaving behind a soul that matched the rotten mud that he had become. Now he only craved the power that he had lost. The heat from the campfire finally warmed her body, casting flickering light across her face and drying the tears there. As Alicia's crying diminished, she thought about what she saw in the ancients, greed. That was the main cause of all the problems she now found herself facing. It had begun with the humans' greed and desire for expansion at all costs, the things that had forced the ancients to create the barrier, which had in turn created Grandtree, the giant tree's greedy desire for water and all the power it granted him, almost destroying the realm of magic, leading to Thunderbolt and Vulcan calling her to the wild side in the first place. The barrier had cracked as a side effect of the Grandtree's greed, trapping her parents and potentially countless others in those pockets of frozen time. And now, the only being left with any significant power was the Silver King, but the greed within him caused him to refuse to share those precious resources. He would not give her a bit of his power, which might help her free her parents and seal the barrier once again. Stronger than ignorance, stronger than jealousy, stronger even than hate, greed was the most destructive force in the world. She was sure of it. Alicia used a corner of the blanket to wipe the last of her tears away. What had the king said about her power? That she still had some within her? It was hidden, yet alive? Could she somehow tap into that? Sadly, she didn't know. Closing her eyes, she allowed the warmth of the flames to calm her. She could still see the firelight flickering through her closed eyelids, and focused on that, letting the rest of the world vanish. Her mind turned inward, and Alicia searched for the power within. Her thoughts traveled through each limb, through her fingers and toes, through her stomach, her lungs, and finally to her heart. Could she feel anything special there? As she searched, she became aware of something. It wasn't a thing she could see with her mind's eye, but she felt something. What was it? Suddenly, she remembered the brief song that Vulcan had sung, calling the sprites to her. It was so beautiful, so mesmerizing. Alicia had done that with the great tree, but hadn't meant to exactly. It just happened. Was that her magic? The power of song? Alicia slowly opened her eyes and saw the cougar watching her. Hope was not gone. There might be one being left who had witnessed her magic, who had seen it firsthand and had been moved by it. Might he know? She dreaded the thought of traveling there, of facing that monster again. After all, she had stripped him of his strength. In some odd way, though, she wasn't surprised that her journey had led her to this. Alicia, exhausted from the events of the day, laid down on her side by the fire, watching the flames slowly die into glowing coals. Smoke curled lazily into the dark sky, like long gray ribbons, and small sparks rose a few feet from the dying fire before winking out. She still had not seen the sprites return, but the cat never left her side once the sky began to darken. She heard Tawny stir. The cougar came up behind her and nosed the blanket away from her back and sniffed at the spots of blood on her legs and arms where the leeches had been. Alicia stiffened. The cat had never been this close to her before. From what she knew, Tawny had not eaten tonight. The girl feared that the scent of blood might cause the great cat to react. Tawny settled down behind her and began to lick the wounds gently. Alicia tensed as the rough tongue cleaned the bites. For several long moments, she waited for sharp teeth to sink into her flesh. But when nothing more happened, she relaxed, taking comfort from the gentle washing. The cleansing soothed the itchy red bumps swollen on her skin. Tawny stopped her ministrations and curled up against the girl's back. Alicia could feel the great rumbling breaths of the cat and closed her eyes. Tonight she would sleep safe and warm. Tomorrow she would start what she hoped would be the last part of her journey and head southeast to the great tree. Tomorrow she would be on her way to see Grandtree. The following day, Alicia and Tawny broke camp. Well, as usual, it's me breaking camp, Alicia thought as she went about her morning tasks. Who knows where that cat got off to? Probably hunting some breakfast. Alicia was starving this morning, after barely escaping with her life the night before. The adrenaline spike followed by the crash left little room for hunger, and she had gone to sleep without eating. She looked into her backpack and found the plastic bag with some trail mix still left in it, along with about a third of her beef jerky. She had been good at rationing it over the course of her journey, relying instead on what she could scavenge from the land. She finished off the last of the gorp, and another couple of chunks of jerky. leaving her with roughly a quarter of what she started out with. She put the empty trail mix bag back inside her pack. On the way, she would search for more huckleberries to fill the bag, along with pine seeds if she could find them. Huh, I'll make my own trail mix with goodies picked up from along the trail. Alicia laughed at her own joke. She was sure they would find a small pond or stream with fish along the way. Alicia had an amazing internal compass in the forest, having spent so much time exploring these woods by herself when she was younger, and she had an innate sense of direction. If she used the lake as a central point, everything else radiated from that landmark. Even though 3 years had passed, she still remembered the general direction to the massive yellow pine. All she had to do was find the tallest hill on the way and scout forward. She felt sure she would be able to see the huge valley based on the distance between the mountains surrounding it. She wondered if Grand Tree was still enormous, as he would be easier to spot towering high above it all. Despite the terror and the setback of the previous day, Alicia was in good spirits. She felt surprisingly confident, given that her past 3 attempts at finding help had ended in disappointment. And she felt an intense bonding with Tawny after the cougar had shown her great care, sleeping protectively close to Alicia's back all night. She imagined that must be what it felt like to be a kitten, cared for so tenderly. Once she decided on her course of action, Alicia knew it was the right path. Remembering back to her last encounter with Grand Tree, the girl recalled the strength and power that flowed through her as she sang. She hadn't felt that ever before in her life. Maybe the great tree had brought out the strength to the surface. Perhaps it had been a combination of both of their powers blending together that had broken through the barrier, allowing her to go home. If they affected the barrier that way, perhaps their combined power could heal the barrier as well. Although she had felt the same way just a couple of days earlier when she set out to find the ancients, this truly was her last hope. It had to work. Tawny returned from wherever she had been roaming and approached the girl. "This is it, Tawny," Alicia said hopefully. "This is the last leg of our journey. The distance is far, but we're so close to being done. Are you ready?" The large cat simply looked at her and blinked its huge golden eyes. Alicia concluded over the past several days that was Tawny's way of agreeing, or at least not being opposed to a suggestion. She grabbed her pack and hoisted it onto her back along with the fishing spear. Alicia did a quick survey of the camping spot to make sure she didn't forget anything. She no longer had her walking stick, having left it alongside the opening of the mine before going in. She certainly hadn't stopped to pick it up when she had fled. There was absolutely no way she was going back to retrieve it. "Okay," she said to no one and everyone. "Let's go." Plotting her course, Alicia decided that she would curve around to the backside of the mountain just to her left, then turn east. Tawny padded alongside her flank, occasionally touching the girl's leg in a reassuring manner as if to say, "I know yesterday was bad, and I'm here for you. You are my family now." That was the sweet scene that Michael mentioned at the beginning, the scene of Tawny cleaning Alicia, which is so sweet. We have cats, and it's always adorable when they do that to us, like they gotta take care of us, big kittens. Okay, so now we've reached chapter 17, True Companions. The next few days passed uneventfully. Alicia found a new walking stick. It was not perfect, but it would suffice. The 2 companions followed various trails, all of them headed in general directions she felt they needed to go, which kept the duo moving at a good pace. Tawny would always wander off during the afternoons, and occasionally, Alicia heard the squeal of some creature she imagined was the great cat's prey. The girl was thankful that Tawny chose to kill her target out of sight, and understood it was only natural. She simply didn't want to see it. When it came to food for herself, Alicia found plenty of berries along the paths, and occasionally a stream to keep her water bottle filled. Everything here looked so lush and vibrant, much more so than her previous visit during the time of the drying, and even more than in her world. Days were spent taking in all the sights and moving through large areas that she had never explored before, even when hiking with her father. Nights were quiet affairs. Alicia talked to the cougar, sharing stories of her friends at home. She described how they would ride their bikes together around the neighborhood or through the local park, always stopping by the stream to see if there were frogs. But her friends didn't appreciate nature the way she did. She also talked about the sleepovers they would have. She and her friends would watch scary movies and eat pizza, screaming and laughing until her father would inevitably show up telling them, "Quiet down, it's late." He would disappear back down the hallway to his bedroom, which resumed their laughter when the coast was clear, but in hushed tones. Tawny would lay in front of Alicia, watching the girl tell stories with her head resting on 2 large front paws. Alicia sometimes looked at Tawny and wondered if the cougar remained with her because she had been commanded to protect her, or if she genuinely enjoyed the girl's company and felt the same connection. Alicia did. She hoped it was the second option. The cat curled up by her side each night now, her furry body hot against Alicia's side. One evening, right as she began falling asleep, she heard the distant howls of wolves, and Tawny raised her head, perking her ears toward the sound, listening intently for a moment before lowering her head back onto her paws. The weary girl felt safe falling asleep like that, the cat next to her, guarding her against the dangers of the night. Alicia thought about what Vulcan had said about many of the magical forest creatures returning. The idea excited her. During the long days of walking, her eyes constantly darted around, looking for any sign of movement, hoping to catch a glimpse of a brownie or a pixie. Naturally, she wished with all her heart that she would see a unicorn, but thought she saw small bushes move where there did not appear to be squirrels. She never saw any of the creatures from her fantasy books. And although she occasionally heard sounds that might be the high-pitched giggles of a gnome or goblin sneaking around to steal her belongings, they might simply be the sounds of a small hidden stream bubbling through the rocks. On the 3rd day after leaving the Silver King, they came to a wide swamp nestled in a valley, where water collected and had grown stagnant. Alicia looked to the sides and around the edges of the valley, but the brush was overgrown. She decided it would be easier to traverse the swamp than to go around. Reluctantly, she trudged down into the valley, shoes sloshing into the water, which was only inches deep. The smell of decay rose around her, noxious fumes bursting from underneath the patches of fungus that grew on the still surface. It reminded her briefly of her short time in the mine, but the sun was out and she let the memories of the encounter fade. Amphibians, including salamanders and toads, scurried or hopped away from her feet. Small water skippers skated effortlessly across the surface, darting away from her approach. As she moved, Alicia kept her eyes alert for giant water bugs. The large bugs like to nest under the surface of swampy water, such as this, motionless and almost invisible, waiting for their food to swim by. They were a couple of inches in length and had large front claws with which to grab their prey, using their sharp probuses to stab their food and suck out the liquefied insides, like a spider with a fly. Normally, they ignored humans, moving quickly out of the way to avoid getting stepped on, preferring to feast on the frogs and small fish of the swamp. But if startled, their bite was painful. Even though she wore boots, Alicia wanted to make sure that she stayed clear of the bugs, especially since the experience with the leaches was so fresh in her mind. She would have preferred to avoid the swamp altogether, but the tangle of brush along the sides was impossible for her to navigate effectively. She knew she was close to her destination, and was eager to move quickly. Off in the distance, along the edge of the small valley, she could see flashes of golden fur. Tawny silently searched for prey that would be her next meal, but refused to get her paws wet in the dirty swamp water. Alicia became aware of a disturbance some distance away to her right. A sudden splashing noise caused her to look. She saw a great wriggling movement as a multitude of swamp creatures began to flee a rising mound of muddy earth. She watched the rising sphere, which looked like a dark brown bubble forming on the surface of the water. The bubble grew larger, rising and expanding, becoming a full 3 feet tall before ceasing its movement. Fascinated, Alicia stepped towards the mound, wanting to see what would happen next. She heard a low growl from the bushes at the edge of the swamp behind her, and turned to see the cat watching her closely. "It's okay, Tawny," she insisted, but stopped her approach to the bubble. Turning back to face it, she heard a wet, sucking, separating noise, like a dog food sliding from a can. As she watched, Alicia saw a line appear in the bubble, bisecting it from left to right. Slowly the line divided to reveal a shiny black orb of incredible size beneath, and it blinked. Alicia was so surprised. Her rump in the water. Tawny's growl grew larger, and Alicia scrambled to her feet, watching the bulbous eye, watching her. She became aware of a new sound, a soggy gurgling like water running down a bathtub drain, then saw a fleshy tentacle-like object emerge from beneath the water, in front of the thing. A full 6 feet in length, the tentacle was mottled pink and gray. She watched the thing slowly sweep across the water. An almost invisible stench, like that of a sewer, drifted up through the air. An almost visible stench, like that of a sewer, drifted up through the air and enveloped the girl. The foul tongue-like appendage collected small creatures and fungus, which stuck into the slime that coated its surface, before retreating back into whatever mouth lay hidden from view. Alicia was both enthralled and grossed out by what she had just witnessed. The great eye closed once more and slowly sank back into the mud, disappearing from sight. Its absence stirred the girl into motion. She turned and hurriedly stepped towards the edge of the swamp, and Tawny, who waited there anxiously. She didn't know how many more of those things lived under this murky water, or how far that disgusting tongue could reach, but she didn't want to find out. They would continue crossing the valley through the bushes alongside, regardless of how difficult that might be. Alicia finally cleared the small depression in the valley and the swamp behind her. By the time the sun had started setting, Tawny had not yet returned from hunting her food. With darkness falling, the sprites appeared once more. Their multicolored lights floated close by, and Alicia thought of trying to sing to them, but she couldn't remember the notes that Vulcan had used. "Are you still watching me through their eyes?" she asked, directing the question towards the unseen ancient. But there was no response, and honestly, she hadn't expected one. Suddenly, their lights began to dim rapidly. Alicia heard a noise in the brush and reached out, putting a hand on her spear. Tawny stepped into the firelight, her muzzle wet, carrying a large salmon in her jaws, and approached the girl, and dropped the fish at Alicia's feet. "You went fishing for me?" Overcome with emotion, she dropped to her knees and threw her arms around the cougar's neck in a tight hug, ignoring for the moment that the creature could easily kill her. They were past that now, and she was so thankful for the cat's presence. Tawny tolerated the hug, and when the girl released her, she moved a few steps away and gently stretched out next to the fire. Alicia found a strong stick and skewered the salmon, giving it a little rinse first with clean water from her water bottle. She remembered thinking not long ago that she would be grossed out by a fish with cougar slobber on it, but was so moved by the gesture that the thought no longer bothered her at all. She cooked the salmon slowly over the fire, rotating the stick every few minutes. It was a large fish, more than enough for her, so she shared some with the great cat, who eagerly chewed up the leftovers, head and all. The following day, they climbed the hill where they could see a tall tree at the summit. Reaching the peak, Alicia took off her backpack and jumped as high as she could to grab a low, thick branch. It was strong, and she swung her legs up like it was one of the bars of a jungle gym at her old school, using it to pull herself up into the tree. She continued to climb, moving gracefully from one branch to the next, easily as if they were rungs on a ladder. Carefully, she made her way higher. Eventually, all the branches grew smaller and thinned out, until at last she had a view. Peering between the pine needles, she scanned the horizon. There! She could make out a larger valley that looked familiar, like it could be the right size. There weren't any similarly sized clearings that she could see, but she wasn't 100% sure that she could identify the form of the great towering tree, but maybe. Carefully, she clambered down the tree and rejoined Tawny on the ground. The cat looked at her questioningly, as if she did not understand why the human had suddenly decided to behave like a squirrel. "I think we're close," she told the cat. "I see a large valley ahead. We should reach it tomorrow, or the next day at the very least." She crouched down at the base of the tree and pulled out a bag of huckleberries that she had been collecting, eating a handful of the sweet things, then taking a long drink of water. Shifting the items back into her pack, she reached out and scratched the cougar between the ears. "You've been a true companion, haven't you?" she said. "I wish I could take you home with me, Not back to the city, of course. A great cat like you would never fit in there. I only mean back to my world. She looked at the cougar fondly. But I suppose you belong here, don't you? Away from humankind. They wouldn't understand you aren't dangerous. She paused. Or maybe you are, and I'm the one who doesn't understand. But you wouldn't hurt me, would you? Even if you were no longer under Thunderbolt's orders, you wouldn't hurt me, would you? Alicia stroked her hand down the cat's neck, feeling the scars where no hair grew. You are strong and brave, she said. You've shown me kindness, bringing me fish. You've shown me care after my meeting with the Silver King. You're good, I can tell. She stood once again and picked up her backpack, turned in the direction of the valley she had seen from the limbs of the tree, and started down the other side of the hill. Boy, would she have a story to tell in her end-of-summer report for her future English teacher. Almost there, she thought. Almost there. Let's see. I think we'll probably... Yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's installment of Finding the Lost, and join us again next Wednesday at noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And like I said before, if you're enjoying this, like this, share this video with anyone else who might enjoy it, subscribe to our channel if you're on YouTube, and thanks for joining us.
Buy a book.
Oh, and buy a book. You can go to callincardbooks.com/shop or michaelscabinbooks.com to purchase them.